Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on such a beautiful fall morning. Before we start off, you can go to the next slide. Let me acknowledge, with respect, the Lekwang speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands in the Songhees Kwana, the Sami people whose historical ties and relationship with this land continues to this day. And I think today we were going to hear a little bit about ties to the land, indigenous knowledge as well. Sarah captures some of the legacy of colonialism and how it affects indigenous people and how they contribute in particular to tackling environmental issues. And that gives me the opportunity to introduce Sarah. You can have a look as well on this. If you move this one. So Sarah is an assistant professor here at UBC in the School of Public Admin. When did you arrive? 2 years ago now? Or, okay, from the University of Hawaii. We're just discussing, what it means to leave Hawaii to come to Victoria, but I think there seems to be a problem here. And it might have to do also with Sarah's strong engagement in the field, also community engaged research, that she finds a home here at UBC and a department in which this is a very strong tradition. And maybe I should cite Sarah's last book, or maybe not, the 2017 UBC book, Everyday Exposure, Indigenous Mobilization, and Environmental Justice in Canada's Chemical Valley in Ontario, where you looked at what this means, this exposure to chemicals being on the ground, and how Indigenous communities are affected and react to this. And I think it encapsulated what Sarah does in terms of her work and also her current project at the center, which looks at a research program that investigates the relationship between climate emergency declaration and democratic participation. So things that I think many of us in different forms think about democratic governments and looking at also as obstacles to those communities that don't have a voice in this process. So I should also mention, although you can't see it very well, that Sarah is convening the CEDAR CODAP, the Climate Emergent and Design for Alternative Realities. We're reflecting on and applying a design justice lens to collaborative research. So here again, I think the spirit and also the ethical questions behind Sarah's research become quite evident in terms of what she does beyond her, in a very narrow sense, scholarly work, thinking about how to work with communities and applying this justice lens. So it's wonderful to have you at the center, Sarah. We started collaborating a while ago when you were still a graduate student. So it's so wonderful to see how you have flourished and grown into your current role as an assistant professor. So welcome back to UBC after 3 years, and more importantly to the center. So the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Oliver, for such a warm welcome. It really is a pleasure to be with this community and to be kind of coming full circle back to UBC after some time away. And thanks to those of you joining online as well. I agree, the hybrid format is it's very useful and helpful to keep us connected with various circumstances and locations. So today I'm doing something a little bit unique, which is discussing a project that I've finished and then kind of a current emergent project and trying to bridge the two. So bear with me if there seems to be kind of two distinct scenarios or topics. And I see them as quite linked, and I'm looking for actually feedback and reflections yourselves as you think about the link between state of emergency declarations specific to climate emergencies and democratic participation. So as Oliver mentioned, I am based now in the School of Public Administration here on campus in the Faculty of Human and Social Development, and I do teach mainly in the community development program, and have, I guess, through my PhD work, started to do a lot of community-based research. And I started out as a much more kind of post-structural oriented scholar, really interested in discourse and ideas and philosophy. But then through doing this more environmental justice oriented work, became more committed to an applied kind of grounded theory justice oriented lens. So I hope to talk about my kind of approach and framework of it as well today. So this image you see, this is actually the image that will be on the cover of my book that will be out next year on life against states of emergency based on research with members of the Attawapiskat Nation. And this image here, this is of Indigenous female leaders and activists and protesters in front of Parliament in Ottawa. And I'm not sure if you can read the image on this woman's sign here, but it says, "Remember Canada, you are a treaty partner." And that kind of message really evokes the intention behind this book, trying to think about what does it mean as a non-Indigenous citizen, non-Indigenous Canadian, to engage in treaty relations that are kind of ongoing and continuous. And so part of the argument of that book is that most mainstream media representations of Theresa Spence's hunger strike and most high-level elite political responses sidestepped that question and instead sort of shamed and blamed the former chief for her advocacy and efforts, saying it's your fault that you've had to declare all of these state of emergencies. It's your fault that there's been this housing crisis. And so instead, I sort of take a step back and say, well, what does it mean to think reflectively about her guiding question, which was, what does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today? So as Oliver mentioned, you covered my journey a little bit. I'm originally from the West Coast. I grew up on unceded Coast Salish territory, specifically Tsleil-Waututh territory, just outside of Vancouver, BC, and did my undergrad and master's, the support and mentorship of colleagues in the room like Oliver and Matt, and Abigail is not with us today. Left to do a PhD at the University of Ottawa on Algonquin territory. And I often say that I split my time between kind of the academy and then the field, as I ended up living in southwestern Ontario in a place called Chemical Valley for a few years, as it turned out, doing research with members of the Aamjiwnaang Nation. And this really shifted my, I guess, approach as a researcher to be much more engaged, much more immersed in the field, kind of beyond the academy or beyond any kind of confined conventional research space. And at that time, it seemed a bit unconventional to be doing that sort of field work. There wasn't a lot of literature and political ethnography, but I did find a few books and felt really, I guess, emboldened when I found that literature. But I think a lot of people thought, oh, it's a very weird approach to be kind of outside, doing that beyond the kind of conventional like interview format or text-based analysis. So this led me to be a much more immersive researcher. My kind of scholarly interests are in environmental justice, political ecology, and as mentioned, also community engaged research. So there's two scenarios that I want to discuss. And the first is, which I mentioned earlier, around states of emergency in Attawapiskat. And then the second will be about kind of climate emergencies more broadly. And I really would love us to collectively think about the politics of state of emergency declarations or climate emergency declarations and implications for democracy. And I'm currently teaching a PhD seminar in research methods, and I keep telling them, don't use my research question, it's too broad. It's a very broad question, you have to narrow. So I acknowledge that I'm at kind of the early stage thinking through the climate emergency implications, but I did want to start with a bit of context related to the Attawapiskat project, just to kind of give a sense of the approach and some of the questions and themes, which I plan to sort of apply and use in this second project here. So this image you see, this is actually of the former band office. And I like this image because it's one of the more colorful images. A lot of images, if you just search Attawapiskat, they're very grayscale, very bland, very kind of damage centric. And in the work that I do, which tends to be quite visual as well, I really try to strike that balance between kind of light and shadows, critique and celebration at the same time. So briefly, why did I get involved in this research? This is an image from the Globe and Mail, and it was featured in the Globe and Mail around the time of Idle No More, a widespread social movement, which you may have heard about in Canada and also globally. But this is a young woman, and she was in Aamjiwnaang, where I had done my field work as a PhD student, holding a sign saying, Chief Spence is my hero. And so there was a lot of solidarity between Indigenous communities, and seeing this young woman from a community that I got to know well, and noticing how moving her ceremonial fast or hunger strike was for Canadians really resonated with me. And I found myself glued to the media. I was just finishing up my PhD as Idle No More was happening. It's hard to believe it's about 10 years ago now. An interesting time to reflect on where we've come since Idle No More. And at the time I was doing a summer school abroad, an environmental politics summer school in the UK, and talking about it. And I guess started thinking that maybe this is something that I wanted to look into a little bit more. How has this movement and how has Chief Spence and her actions been covered in the media? So really, this book is a kind of a critical discourse analysis, looking at media coverage of her hunger strike. I also interviewed Theresa Spence a few times, visited the community when she asked me to go and do work with the youth, which scared me a lot because as a political scientist, we aren't really trained to do kind of youth-based, participatory, arts-based research. At least I wasn't at the time, and so I was quite nervous about her desire for that kind of research, but trying to be sort of sensitive to community leadership and direction and need, I slowly agreed and applied for some funding and built a team, and then we developed this project more fully. But I was apprehensive at the beginning about it. So really the project here that I'm describing was about kind of critiquing the dominant mainstream framing and then trying to reframe narratives of the community. Politically, a larger goal is trying to contribute to dialogue about treaty relations, and then also trying to ground some of the discussions of treaty relations within community perspectives themselves. And then as a non-Indigenous researcher, I see my role as trying to kind of amplify those voices and create space for narratives with that kind of decolonial lens in mind. So to give a bit of context, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, in Attawapiskat, their community has experienced declaration after declaration, such that it becomes quite normalized. And so I'm kind of wondering politically about that. What does it mean when these sort of emergency conditions become the norm in this context? So you can see there's been a range of declarations due to soil contamination, due to the impact of the De Beers diamond mine on their territory, up to more recently concerns with poor water quality. And so here you see featured a leader and musician. This is Adrian Sutherland. He's the front man of the band Midnight Shine. He's also very culturally informed and teaches a lot of ceremonies in the community, which is how I met him initially. And as I described in the book, I had the opportunity to interview him when he was on tour out here. And so actually that interview is the opening chapter of the book. It was initially the conclusion, but it was the best chapter. So my reviewer said, move it to the beginning because he's just such a brilliant, creative person. And so his quotes are really, I think, compelling and telling. And so in this image here, he's wearing this mask and he put that on Twitter saying, with the message of, Canadians need to take seriously the environmental justice and kind of toxic conditions that persist here. And this was pre-COVID. So the face mask has a different meaning now, but really, really showing, it's hard to kind of live freely and breathe. And there's some environmental injustices happening here on an ongoing basis. And the community still to this day struggles with the lack of water quality. I should just pause to mention my analysis looked primarily at the state of emergency declaration, which led to Chief Spence's hunger strike or fast. But then as I was doing this research, there were several other declarations that took place as well. So just a further piece of context, I mentioned the De Beers diamond mine. And so one of my areas of research is environmental justice. And so with the De Beers diamond mine being located in Attawapiskat's territory, there have been concerns over the years about the impact benefit agreement and concerns with the impact and not enough benefit. And I think that this image really captures kind of the paradox of democracy for me, or the paradox of public deliberation. So this is a mace. This is a symbol of kind of convening democratic discussion in our parliamentary legislative assemblies. So this is from Queen's Park, Ontario. And literally the sergeant at arms has to parade in a mace. Every time to open the session, it's this weapon, this historical medieval weapon, but it's adorned with De Beers diamonds. And so for me, that's just a really powerful symbol of a lot that's kind of wrong, troubling, problematic, confusing about our democratic systems. There's a lot of kind of violence, I think, behind a lot of these seemingly inclusive or deliberative sort of welcoming spaces. So my research really kind of seeks to look at the edges of how we include different groups of people, especially Indigenous communities in this context. So the De Beers diamond mine has now closed, and there are sort of lingering issues around like decontamination and kind of reuse of that land, which those concerns are ongoing. But I should also mention that there are continuous concerns in that region overall with the Ring of Fire and other developments, and especially as we all get excited about electric vehicles, I think that territory is going to be really highly contentious in terms of kind of natural resource extraction and rights and that sort of thing. So that's not the focus of this work, but it is one that I know other scholars like Dana Scott and Ed York and others are looking into that is really critical. So this territory is in Treaty 9. So Treaty 9 was signed in 1905 by multiple levels of government. So the federal government, provincial, and indigenous nations. Attawapiskat didn't initially sign the treaty, but they signed later in the adhesions of 1929 and 1930. But I did just want to show this map to highlight some of the territory in Northern Ontario. So the edge, the eastern edge of this treaty is along James Bay, where Attawapiskat is situated today.
Moose Factory is in as well.
And Moose Factory, that's
right.
It is, yep. Yep, I believe it's just a bit further north.
No, it's not. Just showing it. It shows it there.
You can see it. Yeah, sorry, there it's further south. My apologies. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So my driving research questions for this project. So first, how did mainstream representations of Chief Spence's, how did mainstream representations frame her past? Second, what does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today, which is a much more kind of, I guess, theoretical question that draws from this research. And then third, what do alternatives look like? Alternatives beyond this contentious colonial status quo, which is obviously a difficult question to answer and something that's ongoing and continuous. And the book certainly does not resolve these questions, but raises them and hopes to contribute to this ongoing discussion. So I did want to spend just a few minutes talking about methodology because I love research methodologies, and it might sound like a dry topic, but I think it actually is likely of interest to others in this room and online as well. So as I've been sharing with my students, I'm not a quantitative expert, although it would be interesting to bring a quantitative lens to look at kind of the words and patterns in the media coverage, but I certainly did a qualitative research approach informed by interpretive scholarship, which does draw on the tradition of phenomenology, so understanding lived experience. So I've been interested in kind of the lived visceral effects of power relations. I'm influenced by the work of Michel Foucault. I'm trying to kind of move beyond Foucault's work because he's just sort of omnipresent, but certainly some of his thoughts and perspectives around governmentality, biopolitics, genealogy, those concepts certainly do influence this work. More recently, I've been thinking about this in terms of grounded theory, and I know that there's an emergent kind of theory community looking at grounded normative theory, so really trying to apply these high-level concepts to grounded practices, trying to envision alternatives through the voices and perspectives of those who are living through some of these challenges that are all prevalent. So as I mentioned, I conventionally have come from this more post-structural lens, really interested in ideas, framing, discourse, but doing this kind of community-based work has led me to be more grounded, more applied, and that justice lens has become central for me, which is not something that I would say was nurtured or came to light for me through the kind of post-structural lens. And more recently, in speaking with my colleagues in public admin, I've learned there's bigger debates between post-positivism and post-structuralism, and I always thought I was kind of both of these things, but I'm not one that loves labels anyway. So I've come to accept there are sort of post-structural ideas that do influence this work, but I'm not sure the output is itself post-structural, if that makes sense. So that's a bit about myself and how I kind of come to this. So then when I kind of take those bigger ideas and apply them through the practice of this work, some of the tools for me have been critical discourse analysis and feminist discourse analysis. So looking at some of the gendered language and framing of Spence and her community throughout the hunger strike, throughout the state of emergency, looking at elite responses. At the time, it was a conservative federal government, so looking at the high-level officials and what they were saying about Spence, for instance, and the quotes that high-level media journalists were using, for instance. So a lot of that is in the book, and it's actually my least favorite chapter is the kind of critical discourse analysis chapter of the media coverage, because it is just so disparaging. And initially, I had that early in the book, but I moved it to the end because I didn't want that to be the kind of opening narrative or story. And so, following the peer review process, I moved up kind of the voices of community members. So Spence's story and her voice and her visions for the future come a lot earlier. So I sometimes wrestle with this term political ethnography, which is something that I do consider that this work is in alignment with political ethnography, although ethnography has kind of baggage. It has a sort of implication of being removed and observing and not being as maybe participatory, as engaged or sharing kind of a decolonial ethic. So it's something that I reflect on with some hesitation, but do acknowledge that this work is really trying to understand how power relations continue in sites outside of conventional spaces of government or institutions, for instance, and take place in communities and sites, beyond the legislative assemblies. So my approach did involve in-depth interviews. I mentioned Chief Spence, who I interviewed a few times and who reviewed chapters of this book, and had conversations recently about this material, and I wanted to make sure that it felt authentic to her story and her experience. And Adrienne Sutherland, who I mentioned earlier, was also a key interview participant. And this is kind of fall within the larger framework of community engaged research, and I do use community engaged instead of participatory because community engaged, in my view, tends to start from the academic center and work outward, whereas participatory is kind of grounded in the community and they're kind of leading the project. And this was certainly a project that I led and ultimately with a research team. So it was community engaged, but it sort of started in an academic context. But with community members, we developed this mixed media storytelling approach, which I want to share just a little bit about. So here's a young man from the community, Jack Linklater Jr., who is now a leader. He sits on the council. At the time was finishing high school. If you go to the website I'll show in a minute, you can see narratives, digital stories of Jack and others talking about the significance of their land and territory and culture and environment to their overall well-being. So this approach involved doing workshops. So the first time I went, or the second time, I led a sort of critical media studies workshop and then received some funding from SSHRC. So I was able to go back with a team of Indigenous artists and researchers and do some more follow-up workshops with the students. And then we created an online gallery. And so the online gallery is here. You can see it at reimaginingattawapiskat.com. So we gathered a lot of the images, created postcards, which were shared with other youth, and now sit on this online website. And if you move through the website, you can click on digital stories where many of the youth kind of share their stories. But I often say that the missing link or the challenge that lingers from this is how these stories and narratives can kind of speak back, and influence policy change. And that's where I see academics playing a role here to kind of bridge between the communities we work with and sort of complex policy systems and bureaucracies. I have on occasion been invited to share some of this research with different sort of policy making communities, but I find that it's not a very lively conversation. There's awkwardness, there's not a lot of meaningful exchanges. And so I think that's an area that requires a lot of thoughtful reflection is how can community stories influence policy processes? I don't have the answer, but I look forward to hearing what others have to say about that. So I do think that this project has strengths in challenging those mainstream media portrayals and the co-creation process, but it's this intervention back where I think that's maybe a limitation of this approach that I wish could be developed more fully. This is an image that I really love by one of the youth participants, Geraldine Martinez, of 3 women on the canoe looking out to the future, looking to the horizon. And I love this image because it centers the youth and it centers this kind of hopeful vantage point looking forward. So as I kind of segue to the next working project that kind of builds from this research, I did want to center a quote that I just love, that there's no better place to learn the art of love than in community. And I recommend this book to everybody, All About Love. If you haven't read it, anything by Bell Hooks is incredible when thinking through kind of ethics, working with communities, how to bring more community into your teaching and into your research ethics and into your everyday life. And this, actually, this picture I took from the education department. It hangs on their wall by the elevator, and I thought, oh, that's a really nice collection of ways you can bring community values and ethics into your neighborhoods and into, you know, all these different spaces. So you can see that thinking carefully and critically about community is something that matters a lot to me. Okay, so the second scenario, moving on to, you know, where we're at now, and as I recently submitted a SHRC Insight grant, and I thought that the deadline would be later and I'd have more time to work on it, but it came out very fast, and so that was, you know, just submitted last week, and it's based on this new project looking at the climate emergency and climate emergency declarations and the link between democracy, and I'm particularly interested in that as, you know, being someone from the West Coast, noticing the heat dome, particularly from last summer, how that affected human bodies, how that affected marine life. And I've been approached by planners locally within the CRD to look at the link between vulnerability, equity, and heat exposure. So that's kind of one way that I'll be looking at sort of lived experiences of extreme weather events related to climate emergency. But I do have these much bigger, you know, questions and considerations about policy tools when, you know, when a state of emergency is declared, what happens next? Sometimes they're really executive top-down decisions, sometimes they're more bottom-up. So I'm looking to sort of map out these different declarations and think about the implications for democratic participation. To give a bit of context here, so this is an image taken from the heat wave last year. And I will mention that, you know, that the summer of 2021 was pivotal for me because at the time I was a new mother, I was a new nursing mother. And this is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change declared, you know, climate change is a code red for humanity. And I could feel this. I was in the emergency room. It was a really challenging time. And so when I was approached by city planners to work on, you know, heat exposure research, it really hit home. It felt very personal. And then I thought, I'm probably not alone in having these experiences. So what is it like to live through these extreme events? And how can we encourage citizen voice and participation to influence outcomes, policy outcomes that make these situations more bearable at the very least? So, you know, there's been a series of reports that have come out now by the IPCC noticing the challenges related to climate. And as a sort of political ecologist, I'm interested in the ecological, socioeconomic consequences and then how they're felt unevenly across different communities. And I'll be focusing on coastal communities mainly. There was a really excellent report that I want to highlight, and the lead author is Don Hugeveen. And it was a policy report put out by the Climate Action Secretariat, and it offers an intersectional gender-based lens to look at climate change. And one of the highlighted sort of findings here is that there's a disparity in terms of how communities are prepared, how well they're prepared, and how they feel and experience these different extreme weather events. So for those of you interested in sort of policy reports, that's one of the best ones that I've found that really brings that intersectional lens forward. And I'm a board member of something called the Climate Disaster Project, which is led by Sean Holman out of Fine Arts in the Department of Writing. And he's working on a storytelling project to understand these experiences of climate emergency events. And I often, you know, pause and think it's one thing to document and to talk about, you know, the reality that we're all climate disaster survivors now, but we also want to look at the gradient of experience and how communities are coming together and developing ties and solidarity and not just kind of experiencing trauma. So we really want to bring that kind of trauma-informed lens to this work. Okay, so democracy. Why talk about democracy? I guess throughout my political science training, I've been really influenced by different sort of tenets of democratic theory, and so different theorists and critical policy scholars do highlight how such declarations, these emergency declarations, they tell us something about the health of our democracy. And there's a scholar, Bonnie Honig, based in the US, who's written a book about the sort of paradox of emergency politics. And I find that her work really helpful to think through some of these questions when it comes to state of emergency declarations. Also the work of Chantal Mouffe. She's written a few books about kind of the paradox of democracy, and I find her work really useful as well for challenging kind of the functioning and the rhetoric of our democratic systems. So I want to think through that in the context of the climate emergency. So how do we deal with these kind of tricky, layered, multidimensional facets of these emergency declarations when it comes to addressing the climate emergency that we face? So as I've been approached by local planners to work on this health, sort of heat exposure and health research, we're noticing there's a lot of language around vulnerability. And so we're trying to look at, where does that come from? Who's defined as vulnerable? How can we maybe challenge that language a little bit to look at, lived experience? As a new mother, I was certainly vulnerable in a certain way physically to the sort of heat wave, and then others are vulnerable for different reasons, whether that's socioeconomic status or living alone, that kind of thing. So we'll be looking at different, demographics in relation to extreme heat. But at the same time, I want to be mindful that vulnerability isn't something that just exists in a vacuum. These vulnerabilities are often linked to practices of colonialism, policy decisions, and kind of current institutional configurations and limitations. So that's a smaller piece of this bigger project, is looking at sort of equity-informed approaches to heat exposure in the CRD specifically. Something that came out in one of the IPCC reports is that a way to kind of address the climate emergency is to enhance climate literacy. And so I was pleased to see a lot of discussion around arts-based approaches and storytelling to raise awareness and highlight voice in relation to what it sort of feels like to go through the climate emergency and these extreme events. So I think in my introduction earlier, Oliver mentioned design justice. And so this is a lens that I included in the recent grant application, and I've started a reading group around. So it's another book that I want to recommend to everybody, Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need. And it does have a bit of a kind of technology focus to it, given the author's background in sort of science and technology studies, but the introduction and second chapter especially, I think, are really useful for anybody thinking about working collaboratively with communities. And I really appreciate the opening remarks where the author says this is an invitation to build a better world, and a world where many worlds fit. I think that's a really kind of helpful way of thinking beyond some of the problems that we face in our current democratic lives. So perhaps the more boring part of the presentation is here kind of the, what are the questions? What are your objectives? But I did want to highlight them just, for conversation and feedback. So this climate emergency project that I have just tried to get off the ground and hope to work on in the next couple of years would start with kind of mapping out the context. So where are these climate emergencies being declared? What are the implications for community members? Are communities, mobilizing, driving the change, or are these more top-down decisions? Really trying to understand the context for democratic participation. And my aim would be to create some kind of interactive website, which would have potentially different sites and different sort of policy hubs, different examples. And given my experience working in Hawaii, and I'm collaborating with my colleague Astrid Vanessa, we want to work in Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Canada would be kind of our main sites for looking at this. And it would be interesting to do the whole world and do the whole globe, but it's you can only do so much, I think, in a sort of short time span. But if we build a larger team, a larger project, I think it would be interesting to kind of do a larger kind of mapping of these declarations and link them to various policy tools and link them to different forms of climate activism. So the first phase would be that kind of mapping out. And then the second would be really trying to understand the lived experiences. So going to communities, doing interviews, site visits, maybe doing participatory research, whether that's photo voice or digital storytelling, sharing circles, kind of depending on the interests of community, and just trying to see what have been their experiences with climate-related states of emergency. And then the third part is the kind of, so what, and what do we do with this knowledge? And I mentioned that earlier with respect to the Attawapiskat project, that I feel as though a limitation is kind of the what comes next after you do this research, you publish, you have your findings, you do your presentations, and you hope that the right people are listening. Where does change come from? I guess that seems like a lingering question that I have, and it's one that we're trying to think through in this project. And so one of the aims that we wrote in was trying to create, content and resources for different contexts. So post-secondary educators, for instance, policymakers, maybe convening some conferences where you invite policymakers. I feel, being situated in a public admin school, I hope that now I can enhance tools and thinking about how to bridge the academy and policy and community worlds a bit better. But I think that's an area that would require some reflection and refinement. I wouldn't say that I've mastered that. So I'm hopeful that through doing this research and trying to contribute meaningfully to dialogue, there's some ways to speak to the right audiences. So I think that's a lingering question from all of this is how can this research matter? Just put it in really simple terms is how can the outcomes of this community-based research, of these stories, how can they kind of speak back to power, to put it in simple terms? And as I'm teaching research methods with PhD students, we talk about statistics and we talk about stories. And I do think the best kind of, briefing notes probably have both. They have an element of a story, they have an element of your data and your findings and your statistics. But you ultimately need political will at the end of the day. You need those that have the power to, make decisions that are meaningful and useful. So I'm hopeful that this work can offer that kind of bridged space to do so. So that leads me to the end of my kind of formal presentation. Thank you for bearing with me and seeing how this research has moved through different forms and places and iterations. And these are the discussion questions that I have, but I'm sure you have your own thoughts and questions and reflections as well. That first question is kind of the big picture question that I tell my students not to ask questions like that because they are so big, but given that this is a space primarily of academics, I didn't want to pose it. What comes to mind for you when you think about these climate emergency declarations and democracy and democratic participation? And are there examples that you can think of where you've seen kind of radical climate community mobilization, influence policy or lead to change? I'm always looking for, good examples or success stories to help, us not feel a sense of collective despair, perhaps. And then the third question is the one that I've alluded to throughout, which is, how can these stories intervene back on these oppressive colonial hierarchical power relations and influence what I like to use this term, radical policy futures, borrowing a term from Attawapiskat and her colleagues, and she's the Canada Research Chair for Politics of Reproduction at Waterloo. Anyway, I love that term, radical policy futures beyond the status quo. So really, simply put, that is how can these stories speak back to policy and influence power relations, essentially, in more horizontal, democratic kind of ways. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your fascinating research agenda with us. And also, walking us through your development as a scholar, right? How you came to certain questions, how you addressed them, what methodology you explored. I think it's great to hear, not only for us, but particularly for students who are working on their thesis themselves, right? It's a journey, right? And then it's, for me, very, insightful to see, where you've started and, where you have arrived now with your most recent short insight grant application. I think you touched on many aspects that are close to the intellectual scholarly interest of people here in the room. So I'm wondering who would like to start it off with a question or comments. And by the way, you probably realize also that Sarah, at least your second part, looked at something that is emerging, that is not fully developed yet. And I can only encourage you to use this context to explore, get some feedback and check out new ideas and get some discussion going on things that you yourself are thinking about. Emmanuel?
Yeah, so it's
not all the way. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to see whether this was ahead.
Just to warm up the room. It's just that you talked about the heat exposure and luminarity planning, and that's something that I came across a few years ago, and it's more a comment than a question. Anybody knows how much the city of Paris has spent on trying to make water and shade accessible to people who are residing in the core of the city of Paris?
It's a huge.
A lot. Yeah.
5 billion euros.
Oh,
wow. Yeah, so you have today access to water sources, public access, right? Drinkable water sources in 2 different capacities, either with bubbles or without bubbles. Every 7 minutes walk across any one of the 20 arms. And also they've planted many more trees to green the city. And it's become mandatory to all developers to actually green as much as they can the environment. Now, the one thing that I think is so shocking about that number is when you compare that number to how much France is helping others in the world in terms of general aid package, right? Especially with regard to ecological policies, which is just a couple of billion. And you saw that the discrepancy here was really important. And so I'm taking the discussion away from the issue of democracy, but I thought there was a link here because if you're a resident of the city of Paris, probably all of you know, you have to have a certain kind of income. And it's quite significant, right? So the middle class Parisian resident probably averages much more than people who are in this room. Just to,
it's a very
just a comment
example.
to get us.
Yeah, thank you for that.
But thank you very much for your Sarah. It's really interesting.
It just gives you an idea of how widespread these climate emergencies are. That I think you might be a very busy woman going into the future in terms of possible case studies. So the urban responses, I think one is crucial, and you see policy development at the European level and national level, how to think about how, in terms of resilience of urban spaces to address that here.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up on your first discussion, the relation between emergency and democracy. And I'm going to put it in a provocative way. I'm not even sure whether I really believe in the tenor of my question myself, but I think we have to. So here's the short version. The short version is, in your presentation, you seem to advocate for more democracy to control emergencies. And I would say, with respect to the climate emergency, we need less democracy if we want to have a chance to solve it. Yes. So here's the.
I just said that first.
Well, so that's the short version, right? So here's the longer version. I think the work that you're doing is really important in terms of trying to give voice to the people who are affected by these emergency measures. I'm just not sure whether we have effective democratic institutions today in terms of translating that into change. Right? So we can amplify the voices from the community, but will that, especially at the federal level, maybe cities are a little bit different here, federal and provincial level, will those things get through in light of not just corporate interests, but also the election cycles that politicians are subject to? So if you look at a parallel case with monetary policy decades ago, we decided, okay, politicians will not make uncomfortable choices. So let's outsource this to independent central banks, and they will make some uncomfortable choices. Are they doing a good job or not? It's a different question, right? But so from that perspective, you might say, well, if we want to actually make the choices that are necessary over the next 7 years to make sure that we stay within the climate budget and we don't have to do these emergency cycles all the time, we actually need less democracy. So I'm as I said, I'm uncomfortable asking the question myself, but I think it's one that we have to grapple with. And I think your project seems well suited to do so.
It's a good question, though. Why advocate for more democracy if democracy is failing us? Like you're saying, this rise of populism, democracy is in crisis in and of itself. So that's got my brain turned in all different ways. But then I think you alluded to this too. It might depend on the jurisdiction too. So maybe cities are interesting sites of intervention in comparison with provinces or states and federal government. So I think that's something that I'd want to touch on in this project, too, looking at the different sites of these declarations and the role of jurisdiction too.
Because it seems to me that cities are more progressive, but we know that cities are more progressive in their voter outlook, so they might be more ready to accept some costs in terms of adopting policies than we are.
Oliver and then Ivan. Oh, sorry, Matt. Yeah, I wasn't sure that it was a hand. So Matt first, and then Oliver and Ivan. Okay, Matt, go ahead.
Well, I feel like I didn't mean to intervene like that, but I guess this follows a little bit from Peter's question, so it's maybe good to stack them in this way anyway. My question was, I guess, motivated by seeing the reference to Rebecca Solnit. What's that book called? Is it Hope Among the Ruins?
It's like Paradise Built in Hell.
Yeah, I read Hope Among the Ruins. That's another one. And it was such an inspiring message to reflect upon at the outset of the pandemic. I actually included quotes from that book in my course outline for my Poly 101 course, the first semester, basically saying, look, in these disasters, we always hear this, like, the shit is hitting the fan, everyone's gonna go crazy, there's gonna be looting and rioting in the streets, and here's Rebecca Solnit, who's actually investigated disaster and emergency response and finds in these emergencies and disasters just all kinds of hopeful community building activity, solidarities generated, so on and so forth. I think Ulrich Beck in some, kind of project ancillary to Risk Society talked about emergencies and crises as the wellspring solidarity. But here we are 3 or 4 years on, and it really doesn't feel that way. It feels like something's different, right? Whether that's in relation to climate, whether that's in relation to COVID, or all kinds of other emergencies. I'm sure solidarities are being generated, but it just seems like that's not exactly what's happening. And so it makes you kind of think about what are the bases of solidarity that can get us through this kind of stuff, right? And I can't believe this is also kind of provocative and kind of highly conservative. I keep going back to Bernard Crick's book In Defense of Politics, which probably a lot of us had to read as an undergrad. Anyway, he wrote it out of, for a friend in Germany, out of the ashes of World War II, basically saying, in the worst possible scenarios, what is democracy good for? And his argument is you have to preserve whatever kinds of institutional connectivities over space that we have that can provide a framework for people of really different visions and inclinations to come together and solve common problems. He even, for example, praised Abraham Lincoln for doing everything he could to keep the slave states in the Union rather than taking a strong moral stance against slavery. It was more important to produce the institutional framework that would allow Americans to continue talking, blah, 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 right? So the question for you is it time to revive Bernard Crick and talk of resuscitate the institutions of mainstream democracy because they are the only things that can knit people together across vast ideological and political differences in this day and age. And so provocatively, these smaller scale community solidarities are actually even perhaps part of the problem because they're peeling people away from the more difficult conversations that have to be had.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing and provocative question.
Deliberately so. Peter made it safe.
Yeah, it was a good setup. But no, I don't think so. I'm still not satisfied with our kind of formal democratic spaces. I keep hearing actually stories of female senators and Indigenous members of Parliament who just are feeling suffocated in these spaces. And so it's not actually as safe for engaging in this kind of meaningful collegial deliberation and dialogue. So I think there's a lot of need still for critiquing these institutions, but it is hard to think of alternatives, and we don't really have alternatives. Sometimes I do look to like citizens assemblies and these other kinds of spaces that are maybe like meso spaces or something, somewhere between social mobilization at the grassroots level and then our formal institutions, and wonder about that. I know there's different kinds, different ways in which they intersect with formal decision-making rules. You know, in BC, we had the Citizens Assembly on voting, for instance, and there's other ones that may or may not have that decision-making power. But I wonder if there's room for further reflection of those kinds of spaces, if they could be meaningful for these exchanges of ideas. I know there is a body of literature that talks about that. There's like Mark Warren at UBC and that Participatia kind of program and agenda. And there's that Journal of Public Deliberation that talks about that a lot and kind of reflects on these spaces. I still feel really skeptical and critical of them, but I'm increasingly more curious, and I want to see some kind of space. So I think it must be somewhere in between, I'm assuming. I don't know if I've seen it yet. Like I was saying earlier, I'd like to hear of stories or circumstances where there is, where are the constructive spaces for meaningful exchange? I don't know. I feel that they are limited. So I'm not feeling as hopeful, but I share with you your concern that, you know, here we are years later and we want to find spaces where we can, you know, constructively get somewhere and solve these problems, but I don't know if I have examples yet. So yeah, my answer is very measured and I'm hopeful, but I want to be hopeful.
So we have Oliver, Ivan, and then Tamara online. So Oliver.
Maybe I think there's a natural happening by coincidence, but it's sort of
building.
So I'm gonna start with a couple, like, I don't think it's about resuscitating the old. I think it is about something new, but not starting from a blank slate either. And I think, and I'm going to bring sort of much more of an explicit scale kind of component to it. And so I think there's two issues. I think we can't talk about this in the general if we're talking about housing policy or, you know, critical care or elder care. You would talk about it very differently, but I'm going to ground it in what you gave us the entry, right? Climate, disaster, changing ecological realities. And so I think your inclination, which seems to me is like that kind of like more local control. So that part of more democracy, I think has a lot of potential. I think we can illustrate some case studies where we're seeing that. So, you know, I think you're on the right track for sure. I think it's a hard proof to make. And I think the hard part is kind of from here to there, because the superstructure, the constitutional framework, the provincial, even stuff as sort of should be as simple as, you know, the courts and the role of Indigenous rights, authority, Aboriginal control, shared authority, which in my limited career have blown the doors off of everything as far as sharing power. Nonetheless, you have to kind of tackle the superstructure to enable at the same time as you have to, in essence, build new things that are naturally emerging. So you're not even building, it's much more of like probably a growing analogy, right? You're gonna, you know, cultivate, you're gonna be a local democracy farmer, you know, I don't know, something like that. And I think that gets intriguing when we're talking about the topic you're talking about. And then for me, similar, water has the same attributes. And I think the tension would be, you know, there's no perfect way to do it, and each community is different, but I think there is a sequence and you can see some early evidence of that. So maybe the question to you is, you know, in those case studies you've identified, they've really been more like, they're sort of like coming at, the entry point is this sort of high profile aimed at the superstructure conversation, which may be really useful because it creates this underbelly space where the local stuff can actually happen more efficiently or more effectively or more creatively. I don't know, have you seen this sort of up-down piece happening simultaneously in the two examples that you kind of shared?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it made me think of what Emmanuel said at the very beginning, like, look what Paris is, look what cities are doing. And so I think that there's an appetite amongst local government and local planners to do something in terms, that's just, I've been approached more, I guess, at that level to think about these questions. So that gives me hope. I feel like the work that you've been doing gives some kind of hope around collaborative water management and governance. So in terms of Attawapiskat, though, I have to pause, but I can't think of any examples where there has been a lot of, I think the problem has been a lot of federal oversight and mismanagement, unfortunately. So less examples of meaningful kind of, I guess, state withdrawal, which would probably be, I guess, complex, but maybe useful in terms of respecting Indigenous self-determination in that community. That's been a real challenge, is that there's been that lack of respect. With the climate kind of disaster and emergency more broadly, I guess it's to be determined. I do feel a little more hopeful about the local government, less hopeful about provincial, federal levels, but acknowledge the need for some kind of communication between these different levels in a Canadian context anyway. Yeah, I think increasingly I'm getting more intrigued by what's happening kind of at the regional level, and working with the Capital Regional District, for instance. They want to work with First Nations on the southern Vancouver Island and that sort of thing, and kind of build these relationships. So I'm holding out hope a little bit, but I haven't seen like tick the box success stories yet that I can really highlight. But I really want to. I really want to be able to.
Just gonna add one little thing.
Yeah.
When I'm talking about, I'm not usually talking about local government. I think they have all the colonial, archaic superstructure, sclerosis problems that all the rest have. I'm talking really about different governance, which could involve local government, a role for local government, but not, and yet I had seen leadership. But
thank you for your presentation. That's very thoughtful. I'm still trying to get my head around the question, quite frankly. I'm just trying to figure out whether, on one hand, so I think, and I think it's because of the words emergency and crisis and this kind of things, right? So a couple of things come to mind. One is, don't let a good crisis go to waste, which I think is, I sort of see part of this, and then how can we advance some of these social justice, imperatives, in this crisis. But then I also get emergency, and I think fire people, right? Like people who fight fire and who shows up. Like, I actually don't want a horizontal structure showing up in my house this evening if it catches fire. I actually want there to be a chief. In the moment of the crisis, I want strong, definitive leadership, right? So how do we, so I'm still, that's the challenge of the question. So it's like, when we're talking about the climate declaration, let's put that for a moment, that gets declared, I think, mostly by our governments, I think, in Canada, in my experience, right? And then, so then it has, in terms of communities, then where either it's having impacts, right? There's potential to benefit from, but also has potential undesired consequences. So it becomes really important to have those kind of institutions that can ensure that we're informed in doing that. But the challenge is the amount of time it takes to do everything. So this is quite aware, I'm quite in my face right now because of part of what my wife does for a living. We just had that. The provincial government is about to adopt clean fuel standards, you see, and has decided to delay that by a year because their Indigenous consultation has not proceeded fast enough. I spent my life working in the world of, in that world, but I think clean fuel standard. Really, that just seems like we don't have time for that, right? By the time we get around to doing that, then this government falls and the next guy comes in and we start all over. And so how do you balance all that? I guess that's my insanely impossible question.
No, you did a really good point. So many good points in there. And I guess a caution for me to be careful about terminology: crisis, disaster. What are we talking about? They all have different meanings and implications, and that's true. When there's an emergency, you want an ambulance, you want a certain level of standard of care. So it's a very fascinating question, but it seems like time is short and compressed. You don't have time for all this belabored consultation, right? That's lengthy. So you raise really important kind of temporal questions about speed and pacing. So I don't know. I guess the point is maybe that now, before there's the next extreme weather event, you need to plan and carefully think about what to do to involve the voices of those who have been affected and then plan for the future. So I think it's trying to be maybe one step ahead, but I don't know. This is an ongoing crisis. So are you ever really a step ahead? I'm not sure. So what is the role of community in these when we need to make decisions quickly?
I'm not getting mobilized. Yeah, that's what I wasn't really expecting.
It's given me a lot to think about. Yeah. I want to go back to something that came to mind from what Oliver said about kind of growing and cultivating, and I like that sort of language and framing. And I was teaching an undergrad course for Wiebe years ago, actually, with Michelle Limor, and one of the books that we used was called Gardens of Democracy. It's just a pocket-sized book you can read in an hour. It's very small, but I appreciate it because it's a different way. It kind of tries to shift consciousness a little bit, very subtly. And I think that as professors, we can do that with what materials we assign, because we'll get a range of students and perspectives in the classroom. And so I think there are ways that we can encourage, our students to be more reflective and conscious and consider like the collective good and that sort of thing. So that might not seem like a big deal, but I do think that is one way of planting seeds to shift different forms of kind of collective action and thinking beyond just the individual self, for instance. So that's just one little way that we can maybe work towards that growing, cultivating kind of ethic in the classroom, perhaps.
Great. So we go to Tamara, then I have Manuel, and then I have myself on the list. Tamara.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much. It's really exciting to hear about your work. As you know, I also work in the space of climate and in trying to link a lot of young people's voices specifically, to that policy change. And, something that, I'm interested to hear you talk about is kind of the work that you're doing around storytelling, how that is maybe connecting into wider networks. And because, as you know, like John Gaventa's work and Rajesh Chandan and, on the ideas of citizenship and bringing together networks as a greater influence. And even just working at UNICEF for the past 5 years, I've seen that in a lot of different countries of the getting more child voices and into policymaking, but a lot of that is also then working through the formalized structures that countries are setting up. So for example, in Brazil, child parliaments are very much a part of a governance structure. And so there's already an opportunity where children have a formal mechanism to influence government policy. And so then bringing in more of those voices could have, a greater influence. And also in the work that I did up in Fort McMurray with the Red Cross, we were looking at children's voices after the fire. And instead, we not only collected voices and created a social media campaign, which is what the young people wanted, we then also did a quantifiable report doing an analysis of the topics that were brought up. So there's a lot of really good work around, as you know, visual storytelling like Sarah Pink's work. And so actually, analyzing, those stories to actually generate evidence that can influence policy. And I put the research report that came out of that in the chat, as well as a link to the conceptual framework on how to integrate voice into policymaking using creative arts that I worked on in my PhD. So I've thought about that. You said, is anyone thinking about this? Way too much.
But you're in the room, yeah.
So just, I guess I had some questions on what kind of networks already exist that could be connected to would be really interesting, I think. and how to generate some of that, into evidence. And then looking at the mechanisms that are already generating evidence, like the NDCs, are coming out, and we're doing a big analysis right now on which ones are child friendly. So finding out, what evidence is already making its way into policy to be able to, build on that, and some of the increasing efforts to integrate Indigenous knowledge, into policymaking at the global level, if you want to come in there. I think that there are already networks and really strong Indigenous networks, both in the climate change space, but I was at the International Disaster Risk Reduction Conference. There was also a very strong emphasis on Indigenous knowledge. So finding out, who is actually, what networks are actually already have the influence to be able to provide them more knowledge. So anyway, those are my comments, and also then some questions about the research. Thanks a lot. I appreciate being able to join.
Yeah, amazing. So glad that you could be with us, Tamara. Thank you for all those suggestions. And I'm really excited and intrigued to look up the Brazil example you mentioned, because I'm actually not familiar with the child parliament. So, and I definitely want to read the findings that you mentioned from it sounds like the report, the quantifiable report coming out of the Fort McMurray wildfire experience would be a really relevant report to look at. So thank you for putting that into the chat, and also reminding us to think about networks, because we've been talking about superstructures and institutions and different levels of government, but not really about networks. And so I think that's a really important, scale or site of analysis not to lose sight of in this research. So yeah, just want to say thanks for reminding me of that. I know just one example that comes to mind, because a lot of the concern in Attawapiskat related to state of emergencies had to do with youth mental health as well. It was really inspiring to see young people share their stories. They would sort of upload their personal videos on a website called wematter.org, and then share those stories with different policymakers at various levels of government. And so I think that nonprofit We Matter was really instrumental in kind of moving between community voices and different policy levels. So thank you for the network reminder. I think that's really important.
So we talk about alternatives to democracy, and I was thinking, what about tyranny and autocracies? Because here, I think we are touching on something that we discussed a little bit, which is a confusion in terms of, what democracy can do there, right? We have democratic systems, and we can push it down a little bit, like we do like Oliver was suggesting. We could look at what larger cities and urban regions can do more, effectively in a way, or efficiently, depends on what we care. If we care about money or less. But we have always had instruments, democratic instruments, to control agencies and bureaucracies that are very autocratic in the way they act, right? So for instance, policing and the military, there is no negotiations. From when the top gives an order, the soldier acts, and it's the same for police officers. So I'm thinking these are things that we can't completely ignore when we're looking at these situations. And so my question for you is that, is this a problem of accountability and transparency? Because the way these agencies are always, in a way, made accountable to states and governments and elected officials when it's not actually at a national level. It's through these procedures. And I like to think that the European Union has struggled with this quite a bit, because we talked about, 15 years, we talked about democratic deficit, but today it's one of the most accountable, transparent, complex system of governance that exists in the world. And I remember, and that's why I'm concluding with this, but I remember interviewing Dick Anner when he was the Director General for Regional Policies about what had happened in New Orleans just happened again, right? And he said to me, what surprised me is that we have the instruments to intervene within 10 days or 2 weeks in the EU, and the United States don't. Because they had financial instruments to basically help whichever. And so, when a disaster happens, so I'm just thinking, okay, these people have obviously worked around those tools of accountability, but also kicks back in terms of having the financial help head. You know, for instance, so you have had issues in Germany last year, you've had issues in France, you have recurring issues in certain regions of Europe, and every single time you have huge resources that come from the EU into those regions to actually help people, right? And I just discussed it recently when I was in Hungary, actually last Wednesday, with the head of the former president of the Committee of Region, and he said, well, in Germany, it was horrible as well, because I talked about what happened in our region, right? In the Lower Vancouver region last year. And he said, but the EU there were lots of resources coming on, but we're still cleaning up and it's still been a disaster. So I was thinking, you know, are we refining this? Like, you have to have kind of emergency. You've got these kind of autocratic organizations that come in, you also have this. But so is that something that you would be interested in looking into? Is how these agencies, first of all, are they equipped? Are we confusing the whole deal around democracy and autocracy?
You raise a lot of interesting points in there about, I think linking back to what Ivan said earlier, kind of about like time as well, and efficiency, and when do we need quick decisions and resources to move? Because that's when you have those executive decisions, things move quickly, right? But if you wait for the slow pace of kind of, you know, lots of consultation, engagement, it just slows things down. So it sounds like you might be referring to some intriguing examples where there's kind of both in a sense. There's really thoughtful mechanisms in place that they're ready when an emergency happens, that things can move because they have such maybe accountable and transparent processes administratively in place that make that work well. So that might be
so they don't fall into the whole debate about democracy versus time.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of states are confused. They have agencies that are extremely efficient. And when these things are never discussed, but these agencies are continually under control, basically.
That's a good example. Yeah, I would be interested in learning more about
it's just an idea.
Yeah. Thank you.
So after so give me 1 second, Samuel. I'm next to you. So while my colleagues have brought up all the big, interesting, and provocative questions, I have a more mundane or two quickly mundane questions about your research. One is picking up on Ivan. Say, when do we actually have an emergency? I think taking your interpretive approach, right? Is this a kind of a policy or legal category, or is it also up to the community itself, right, to declare an emergency and use this as a tool for political mobilization, securing resources and so forth, right? So is this something that you take as something prescribed by state authorities, for example, or is it something that is also being debated and contested, right? What and when do you have an emergency? And the other one is, I'm just wondering, listening to you, how do you feel about the literature on resilient communities, on resiliency and so forth, right? There's lots on that. And you could, you decide to take the democracy lens, right, to address this. But as you know, responding to climate emergencies, there's lots of, more, in a way, policy-oriented resiliency approaches out there. Why didn't you go this route?
Yeah, those are good questions. Those are not mundane questions. Those are actually really challenging ones. And I actually kind of like that you almost rephrased a research question that would be useful. Is kind of how are climate emergency declarations defined and used, actually, which is an important one because it depends kind of who's declaring it. And is it just a rhetorical tool to create awareness and shift social consciousness, or does it have like direct, meaningful resource allocation implications? So I think that your question is one that I actually want to make note of and probably include a bit more closely in the research. And I think you kind of phrased it really clearly well there, kind of like what is, you need to kind of start with what is a climate emergency declaration, which is what I would want to do in that first phase of research, kind of who's declaring it, why, when, what are the implications. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think it's something that does get used quite a bit rhetorically, but then it doesn't carry the same weight as a state of emergency, which has really clear implications for process, for response. And then the literature on resilience always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And the reason is actually my PhD supervisor, Michael Orsini, wrote this wonderful piece in Policy Options. It kind of critiques the sort of labeling of resilience, and it refers to a bit of a connection between resilience and neoliberalism, and assuming that individuals should just be resilient and flourish and thrive. But I know in speaking with Michelle Lee Moore and others that literature is actually quite nuanced and varied, doesn't all assume that you're responsible for your well-being through these disasters. I think there's a little bit of a danger in the resilience framing, is that like, we're all gonna be okay, just, just figure it out sort of thing. But I have to admit that I'm probably not as well versed in the robustness of the resilience literature as I should be. But I don't like using the word resilience very often, because it always implies a previous kind of wound or harm or injury. But then when you are talking about a disastrous event, it does make a lot of sense because you're linking it to a specific event. So it's just, I have a personal discomfort, I think, with the term. But I acknowledge its kind of value and significance. So I don't know, I would probably have to work through my own discomfort with it and read a little bit more in the literature and put it probably in conversation with some of that democratic literature. But you're right to ask me that question, because I'm sure I'll be asked that a lot, and people will be asking, what about the resilience kind of, discussion and conversation? So yes, thank you for asking that tough question.
Thanks for your patience.
Oh, thank you. So I'm just curious about small changes or possibilities at the microscopic level. And so my question is, how do you imagine climate justice or design justice at the local level, whether as a reactive response or proactive response to climate emergencies?
Yeah, I think it's neat that we'll keep coming back to the local level. And to be honest, when I was in Hawaii, there were a lot of examples of local initiatives to engage with environments in different ways beyond capitalism, beyond extraction, much more kind of spiritually informed ways of connecting one's relationship and body to land and environment. And I saw that was very prominent in a lot of the kind of approaches and sort of ontological orientations of my colleagues at the University of Hawaii. Some of those who are kind of Native Hawaiian and talked about aloha aina and this really deep connection to land, body, territory, environment. So I do think that there are these really compelling examples of alternatives to the problems associated with colonialism and capitalism and extraction that start at this grassroots level, and literally communities like replanting and trying to reclaim like local food production, for instance, trying to reclaim certain plots of land, trying to provide language education in these environments and spaces. There's a large movement. There's this group called Aloha Aina Futures, and they've created this kind of economic playbook that it emerged in response to the pandemic. And there were a lot of thinkers, a lot of kind of critical Native Hawaiian feminist thinkers as well, trying to say this is a moment for us to imagine beyond the status quo. So I find that Aloha Aina Economic Futures playbook, it's called, really valuable in terms of taking this moment of crisis and using it as a portal to kind of think beyond the status quo. So although I've been searching for examples, sometimes I am taken back to the Hawaiian context when I reflect on these efforts to create public discourse and awareness about alternative kind of like economic systems and ways of being. And so I think that does come down to a different relationship to land and environment, being less extractive and kind of more caring or more cultivating, to put it in simple terms. And I was on a panel discussing kind of critical ecofeminism recently, and a lot of us were talking about how do we kind of maintain critique, a critical lens, but then also a kind of caring lens to it. So I know that's kind of getting off into a more perhaps philosophical lens, but I think that can be really applied concretely in certain places, whether it's like amplifying the voices of those community organizations that are kind of reclaiming land in different ways, or in how we teach, what content we use, or if we take our students outside of the classroom, learning from communities. I think these are all different ways that we can kind of engage alternatives locally. So I do think there's a little bit of hope at that kind of local level.
I think finishing off your presentation with referring to hope, that seems to be appropriate to wrap up this session. So thank you very much, Sarah. Well, good luck with publishing your book. It's almost out. I'm looking forward to it and getting your new research off the ground. I hope, Shirk will give you the funds to do this. There's definitely enough things for you to explore, and unfortunately, probably more emergency events that we will face related to climate change. So thanks very much. And also the courage to say, look, this is my new research agenda, right? Let's see, what you have to say. I think it's a pretty quite a fruitful exchange. And thanks for all my colleagues bringing up the difficult questions as well. So have a good day.
Thank you.